Rules of the Startup Game. The Startup Guide to Startups.
Hello and welcome to the sixth and final episode in our special series. Over the past 5 weeks, we've detailed for you the right kind of structure that you can pick for your startup venture. We've also discussed the 3 Ps of starting up, that's permissions, protection, and paperwork. We've highlighted the do's and don'ts of contracts, the how-tos of term sheets, and the good, bad, and ugly of shareholder agreements. On this sixth finale show, we're going to focus on the common mistakes made by startup entrepreneurs. And to do that, I have with me P Pradeep of venture fund Aavishkaar, entrepreneur Valerie Wagoner, she's founder and CEO of Zipdial, and lawyer to many startups, Ankit Majmudar of Wadia, Ghandy. Now, based on their vast experience, the 3 of them have listed for me the common mistakes that startup entrepreneurs tend to make.
When he is raising money, the first thing an entrepreneur is interested is when should he raise the money and how much should he raise the money, and which would then mean for him he always tends to underestimate how much money that he actually needs, which is something we advise and we suggest that your expectation of what the business is likely to grow in this period of time, in this framework, is not going to happen. I think one thing we can all be sure of is that what will be exactly the same is what your business plan will not look like this in 1 year's time. What might happen is when you actually, the best time for any entrepreneur to raise money is actually when you don't need it. Because when an entrepreneur actually raises money when he is running short, when he needs it day before yesterday, it always tends to get far more delayed. And investors then become doubly smart, triply smart. So I can speak as an investor.
You know, at Zipdial, we're an Indian company serving India who's now expanding into Asia. And we ended up fast forwarding our international expansion plans by a year ahead of when we planned, because we had the demand from our customers to go international. That's a fantastic thing. That's not a worst case scenario, but we also didn't exactly budget for that in the funds we had raised. So for a number of reasons, like, it's about removing the hesitation to make the right decisions. Because if you hesitate before hiring the right person, or hesitate before entering that new market when you have the opportunity, you might lose the upside. Plus, if you hire the wrong person because he's less expensive, or hire the wrong, external firm to work for you, or invest in the cheaper technology, that can come back to cost you more later. So, removing that friction from the right decision making is critical.
Ankit, is this a common situation that you think most entrepreneurs don't account for right at the beginning?
I think it's very true in the context of where we look at it from a legal perspective, because many entrepreneurs tend to focus on the good side. What's the potential of doing an IPO? What's my limitation in terms of raising new money? What's my potential of going out and spending capex? But what they don't really think about is what happens if things go very badly wrong. And it's an uncomfortable question, but it's something they have to answer. For example, what happens if you need to raise cash, as you said, at a very short notice, and you need to raise cash at a price that's significantly below what you had initially anticipated? What happens if your existing investors turn around and say, well, we need to be brought back to the lower value because you're now raising money at new value? And because of that, the promoter gets diluted. He may get diluted down to a level where he's no longer in control. Those sort of situations often don't come to the promoter's mind because he's not looking at those situations as being the most likely ones.
Right.
But, well, they're not unlikely, I would say, in the context of a startup. And frankly, they are something that they need to spend more time on, because in our experience, in good scenarios, things tend to go well. People tend to relate to each other very well. When things go wrong, that's when the friction between investor and entrepreneur, between entrepreneur and employees, becomes more evident.
The right amount of money is important. The number of different parties you get that money from is the other point to manage, particularly in the startup ecosystem in India, which is more nascent. The style of angel investing at the early stage is different. I might have raised the same amount of angel round for Zipdial from 2 angel investors in the US versus the dozen or 2 dozen that I've talked to in India. Where they're writing smaller checks and there's more of them. That becomes a very complex thing to manage if you're lucky enough to be successful enough to have these next level conversations with Series A investors, et cetera. Getting signatures from all of these people, getting them aligned to the decisions that you believe in are right for the company is a challenge. Being careful to segregate what are the important reserve matters that are critical to have investor oversight into versus more operational matters like how you hire and how you build, your office space and things like that, which if you don't handle these issues right in terms of your shareholders agreements, might end up being an overhead for you.
There are two issues to this. One is a practical aspect, like you said, going after 10 signatures, going after 10 investors, get them to sign on. The other is the more qualitative aspect of, is there a degree of alignment between them?
Sure.
I think sometimes investors, particularly when they come in at different stages of a company's life cycle, have different visions, have different exits, have different pressures on them. And because of that, sometimes a promoter gets put in a spot where he doesn't know which investor to cater to. So it's very important when you have your negotiation, both as an investor and as also as a promoter, to ensure that everybody sees a common path towards the growth of the company and towards exit. Otherwise, a few months later, we've had situations where investors don't see eye to eye on what is the exit plan. Is it an IPO? Is it a strategic sale? Is a window 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? There really isn't alignment between them. And that's something which entrepreneurs need to bring out. And if there are issues, it's best that they come up at the stage of fundraising itself, rather than having to deal with them a few years out or in the next round.
We've been talking about formal investors, angels, seed funds, whatever you want to call them. What about the informal investor that precedes even all of this, right? The family, sort of member that you tap into, or the friend. One of the things you wrote to me about, and I thought that was interesting, is that informal investment that's come into your business. How do you ensure that over a period of time, if you haven't paid it back, and if it's a substantial amount of money, that you formalize it so that the subsequent investors who are coming in, who are formal investors, there is no sort of clash of interests between the two?
Most of the money that comes in, it would be normally sitting there as some sort of an unsecured loan, or and many times it may not even be documented in a proper manner. It is just there and it is just lying somewhere, and which for a later round institutional investor becomes a little tricky to handle this, because at one stage we know the company has to some manner have an obligation to those people. So how do you do that? So then normally there could be a scenario of option. Either we say, can you please let this amount of money get converted as part of promoter equity or something like that, and which means that they all become stakeholders in the company. And then there could be the next step will be then at what price do you convert that promoter equity? Should it be converted at par, or should it be at the same value as we come in? So and many times we have let it go and said let it be at par because you have come in much earlier, so come in at convert at par, and then we will decide the valuation later on. Or there could, in some situations where that becomes difficult, then we say, all right, then maybe do a part conversion, and part of that can be repaid to you on a form of a certain contract which says every 6 months there is a certain amount of money that goes out, which doesn't impact the company's cash flows. Or we could say, if the cash flow of the company is minimum not less than so much, then you pay this.
So conditional payouts of sort.
You hold this back.
The ideal solution to all of this is to make sure that you have a formal documented relationship with them, which outlines what is the structure, what is their investment. But again, it has to be a thought through process. For example, if somebody's putting up half my capital and I choose to give him half the shares in the company, well, he's bringing in money, but what do I value my idea at? Maybe debt is the right form rather than equity at that stage. These are questions which, again, people don't spend time over, and I think it's something that's worth spending time over, because it can become a very large component of your capital at a later stage. So it may be a very small sum of money, but it has a huge impact.
And not only, obviously from a ownership perspective and all of that, but so we were bootstrapping. Zipdial was bootstrapping on friends and family money for the first year or so. We converted that with has equity with the seed round, just like all of our other angel investors. They just don't have the benefit of having put it in earlier. But that was very clear that was the expectation up front. So setting those expectations, particularly, I have definitely felt a personal stress over the fact that my family is invested in the company. At some level, that really lights a fire, right? Because doing right by my investors also means doing right by my family. But that also, it's important to, you never want that to be a distraction. Like in general, as an entrepreneur, you never want things to be a distraction that shouldn't be. You have way too many problems to solve in life. So having things formalized, like obviously it protects you, your investors, your friends and family investors, but it also just gives you peace of mind so that you can focus on the problems that matter.
Also, I mean, I think what happens is like what we have seen, these very early stage investments are very emotional investments as well. I mean, they are not very rational, they are not necessarily, I mean, it's much easier for an institutional investor to understand and put things into a piece of paper and sign it. But for an individual or an aunt or a cousin or a brother or a sister, it's much more than that. There is a much more emotion attached to it as well.
Yeah.
And to some extent what Valerie said, so there is a lot of, and say that I am the person who has actually helped you grow from here to here.
Why am I not getting
Why am I
a
not getting
substantial
it?
part of your
Absolutely.
success, right?
Absolutely. So why am I not? So I should also be therefore become so it therefore becomes that much more important on the early stage institutional investor to take these matters into account and find an amicable way of resolving that right there at that stage, and not let that point linger along on the company, because then it becomes a problem going ahead.
Rules of the Startup Game. The Startup Guide to Startups.
In our case, so it certainly can be very tricky, particularly for first-time entrepreneurs. In our case, it was pretty clear, given our background, skill sets, and what we wanted out of the experience of building the company. So it was very clear from day one that Sanjay was going to be in a non-operating chairman role. It was very clear from day one that, you know, Amia, the IIT grad, is going to be our COO, and I'm going to be CEO. So it's the challenge becomes when we're like yin and yang. We have extraordinarily complementary skill sets, and we trust each other immensely. So that's worked out beautifully. But the challenge is when you have too many people who also are too similar to each other. If you're a first-time entrepreneur who maybe is starting up with your batchmates or your friends or something like that, that's when there become conflicts, because you don't complement each other as much as you might overlap. And there's just not room at the table in a young company where there's limited resources and you have to make decisions fast. And so that can lead, I've seen that in other companies, not in Zipdial, but lead to challenging situations.
It sort of manifests itself in different ways. You could have a situation where, from an investor standpoint, if an investor notices a difference in dynamic between the founders, that can come in the way of the founders being able to raise money. Because we've seen situations where investors see, well, one guy's pulling at one end, the other guy's pulling at the other end. Maybe they work together well, but we don't know whether they'll continue in that fashion.
Right.
There may not be a festering dispute. They may get along really well between them at that stage. But even the presence of any sort of discord between them in terms of viewpoint, in terms of outlook, that can make an investor extremely shy of getting into that situation. It may happen that things don't work out. You can't help that. But if you at least have a formal thought process around what's going to happen if these situations take place, or you at least spend some time thinking about what's the relationship between the two of you, how is it going to play out in the future, it may make things much easier if there ever is.
If things go sour. Have you run into this often?
In situations we face that there are differences of issues, we try to some extent, to going back to what Valerie said, to say, if there are three people together, what is A and B responsible for, what is C responsible for, and we try to formalize it to the extent as possible. Yes, and we try to see if there are proper employment contracts signed between each person and the company, and say, I am responsible for this and this and this, and B is responsible for this and this and this, and C is doing this. So among them there is some clarity as well. I mean, so that it's not just between the investor and the promoters, but also between the promoters there is clarity that
sure,
I am expected to do so much.
Whatever you put on paper day one is never going to be the same. Your business model may be the same, you may continue to grow, but inevitably a young company is so dynamic that what fits today is not necessarily what fits 6, 12, 18 months from now. So also, not that you have to plan out every permutation and combination of what could happen and then therefore put it into a legal agreement, but you should be open to the fact that things are going to change. Someday we may need to hire a new CEO, right? And
absolutely. I mean, to the extent that the promoters should be aware that at some point of time they may actually just stay as promoter founders and let somebody else take over the execution
Because you
of the
don't
company.
necessarily have the skills to
You
take
may
the
not be
business
the
to the
best
next
person.
level.
It's more often than one would imagine, because IP is very often for startups, there's something that's core to the business. It's an idea, it's sometimes a process, maybe it's software, maybe it's a property. There's something that's unique about it, there's something that's different. Protecting that particular asset, because that is core to the company, is, if you think about it, the most important part of a startup.
Right.
But unfortunately, a great deal of time is spent on exploiting that, or making sure you can develop it, but not making sure that you retain it in a manner that you initially thought you would, and for a significant period of time. And again, this doesn't just impact you at the stage of your wanting to, say, sell the company 10 years out or IPO the company. It could be as simple as finding out 6 months after you've started your company and gone out to raise money. Investor comes in, does a due diligence and says, hold on, but you don't own this stuff, somebody else does.
Yeah.
You could even have situations where employees of the company make claims on the IP. You could have situations where you don't register leases to a very important property. Now, some of them are small things, some of them are larger issues.
Leases to very important property. Is that what you just said? So when you speak of IP, you're using that, as a broad asset categorization. You're not just saying that if you create this fabulous app, or if you create this beautiful tune, you're saying it sort of extends to all the assets that you have.
It extends to anything that is a value creator within your company. Because if you, for example, if you set up this great factory, you spend a lot of money on it, on a set of premises which you don't have any interest in, and 6 months later you're going to lose that set of premises after spending all of that, well, you lost what's core to your company.
Sure.
On the same basis that if you lost your trademark, and your trademark is your domain name and the most important thing in your company, well, you lost that. So I think it boils down to making sure that you protect what's core to your company, both from people within the company, from outsiders, and to some extent even from investors. You may want to say, and a smart entrepreneur may very well say, I will keep the IP with myself. I will license it out to this company, yes, but I may license it out to another company tomorrow.
Right.
Now, thinking through that process, am I accruing the maximum value by keeping the IP in this company itself? Or is there something else which later I want to exploit by myself and get separate value for? Those are thoughts that an entrepreneur needs to give before he decides what structure to follow.
Valerie?
Yeah, I happen to come from, my company, mobile payments company, previous to Zipdial. It was a business head, and part of what I was doing was managing the patent portfolio, and so I filed 19 patents for that company. So I was very well versed, as entrepreneurs go, on the importance of intellectual property, and we have 2 patents with Zipdial and whatnot, or pending rather. But an important side note on that, though, is Ankit used the word asset. It is an asset. It is not a defense strategy. Do not think that because you have IP, you can't also win in the market. Because at some level, your IP is only as strong as the cash you have to enforce that later on someday.
Yeah.
And any young company does not have that cash, right? Or you should be spending it on something else, growing your business. So most importantly, IP is an asset, not a defense strategy, and it should be, you still have to win in the market to actually make it worthwhile.
How much of the law are you supposed to know yourself as a startup entrepreneur? How much do you rely on advisors? How much money do you apportion in your budget for the right kind of legal or accounting advice to make sure that you're compliant?
I think we would actually want the entrepreneur to be really focused on where he gets the next rupee from, rather than getting over-focused on the legal aspects and getting worried about it.
But you'd also recommend that they have a quarterly list of compliances that they're taking off.
As an early stage investor, to work with the entrepreneur and put in place systems and formats which we sit together and help him or her to understand and put what these tick marks actually mean, and do these tick marks and yet not compromise when you go out and make your next sale, which to the entrepreneur's mind, this means this is a waste of time.
Yeah.
Entrepreneurs think this is a massive waste of time.
This is not priority.
This is not what I am supposed to be doing.
This is not priority.
But as an early stage investor, it's a very fine balance which we say, while we agree that this is not what you have been doing in the past, but this is important.
Again, it's a question of balance. One doesn't want an entrepreneur who gets too involved in the legalese and says, oh, I'm going to sit down and spend 22 hours negotiating a document. That's not the right kind of promoter from an investor standpoint. He may be very good at it. He may love the idea of negotiating. but his focus, his skill set really is the business.
Right.
To some extent, you need to be able to withdraw yourself and say, fine, I'm leaving, I'm getting somebody who is competent to be able to negotiate that. At the same time, yes, you need to be cognizant to give it the requisite amount of importance. It is an important issue. You need to get your books in order, you need to make sure you negotiate your agreements appropriately.
It's important to spend on the right talent and firms and advice to help you,
Your list listed, don't skimp on
don't
the C and
do not
CS.
skimp. Do
Is
not
that
skimp.
what you suffered?
Oh, we've replaced 3 company secretaries, in the first 18 months, and we're in like good shape now. But we're at 3.5 years now. But the first year and a half was like replacing after replacing after replacing.
Well, you couldn't find the right person?
Well, we thought that just anybody could get it done. Turns out no. Turns out you still need to focus on who's going to get it done right, because you don't want to have to spend time thinking about that. So you do not skimp on those things.
All right, on that note, Valerie, Pradeep and Ankit, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this series, Rules of the Startup Game. It comes to a close with this episode, but if you've missed any of our episodes, you can revisit them on the firm website or on YouTube. You can also send us your questions, and feedback is always welcome. Thanks very much for watching.
Rules of the Startup Game. The Startup Guide to Startups.